Take three. Let's try this again. Can everyone hear me? Milo, what are you doing, huh? I love how 40,000 people are just watching me sit here, wait for. There needs to be a simplified way to do this. Please. For those of you who are joining, I'm just waiting for Raquel to request. There she is. Let's see. Yeah, Instagram really needs to help me out here.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh my God.
No, this is such a process. I'm like, it should be simplified, but what can you do?
Yeah, I mean, now I know why everyone is always like frantic when they start.
I know. Just
I'm,
sitting like at myself. I also like think I like look okay, and then I turn on my Instagram live and I'm like, oh God, it looks like I haven't slept in 80 years.
no, you look great.
How are you today?
I am doing okay. I'm a little frantic. I was out with friends yesterday at a defund the police party here in Brooklyn.
Hmm,
Party, but it was also a direct action.
sure.
And so we just kind of marched in the streets, obviously, and then we ended up in front of one of our council members' homes.
Mhm.
And basically, we were out there, like, saying defund the police and just making our claim. So it was very powerful.
That sounds amazing. I had the biggest protest in LA yesterday. I think it was the biggest. It was like 20,000 people, and it was like just. I wasn't a part of that one. I had some things I had to do, unfortunately, but that was insane. That was. It's so crazy to see. It's very inspiring to see. It just feels like a revolution. You know? Like it feels like things can change. How do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels like I have been saying, I'm like, y'all, the revolution is here. Like, I've been saying that to like friends and folks. And it does feel like that. It feels like people are thinking differently and like more critically about systems, about power, about oppression, all of that, all of that stuff, and it feels different. Like 2016 felt like a revelation of sorts,
Sure.
but it feels like people are ready to like throw down and make some real change.
think it I think it says something about our generation. I think the younger generation and the older obviously, but like and everyone in between, but the younger generation is fired up about everything. And I love, it's like you don't have Greta Thunberg for nothing, like I just feel like she's like such a voice of her generation, and like it just goes to show how smart top of it the young people are. And I think maybe it took like this generation of young woke people to actually do something about it, um, or at least I hope. But it feels like we're making progress, it seems, and maybe a little bit at a time, but it does feel hopeful to me, at least in my. But thank you again for agreeing to do this and coming on here. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Raquel Willis, pronoun she, her. I am an activist, a writer, soon to be author, knock on wood, um, and and an activist. And I've been doing a lot of different things over the years. I came into writing through journalism school. And a lot of people don't know this, but I actually I started out wanting to be a songwriter in middle and high school. So like I have a stack of like notebooks just with all these like cheesy like songs about like boys and nobody understanding me. And that was also my outlet to kind of first really tell my story in some ways to myself, as my big sis in the movement, Janet Mock, says a lot. Another Black trans woman who has accomplished so much. But yeah, that was when I first started kind of trying to tell myself my story as a budding Black transgender woman. Um, and so, just for a little context, I am from the South, honey. So I am from Augusta, Georgia. I don't know how many of y'all have heard of Augusta, Georgia. It's not Atlanta. It is its own, particular place. And I didn't really have other queer and trans folks to lean on. All of this discussion about racial oppression and all of these different layers of oppression, gender oppression, we weren't really having those conversations in a general sense. And so it really wasn't until college that I got a chance to study, like feminist theory and women's studies and meet other trans people in particular and really piece together my story.
Yeah. Where did you
Yeah. Oh, I went to the University of Georgia.
go?
Yeah, so I went to the University of Georgia, and while I was there, I was studying journalism. Side note, our journalism school is called the Henry Grady College of Journalism, and so Henry Grady is like important in like journalism history as a voice from the South, but he also was a staunch white supremacist.
Uh,
So just giving y'all context that like the remnants of enslavement and of those earlier periods of even deeper racial oppression live on today. And there's a movement to kind of get that place renamed, hopefully. So that's just a side note.
Sure.
Um, yeah, and so I left journalism school and I worked in my first job at a small newspaper in Monroe, Georgia. So even smaller than Augusta. And at that point, I was out as trans to like family and close friends and in local community. But for work professionally to try and keep a job, I really went back into the closet in a lot of ways. So I wasn't out about being trans in that first job. It was the height of like the Tea Party era, so like the precursor to like Trump and the people that support him now was like the Tea Partiers and they like the Sarah Palins and John McCain, all those. Um, and I really there were points where I feared for my life, if I was going to be found out and lose my job. Um, and then after about a year and some change, I left that job and I went to Atlanta, Georgia, finally made it to a bigger city. And that is where my mind just opened up. I mean, in movement work, we all kind of, a lot of us talk about the moments or the spaces where we were radicalized, right? Or where we started to really piece together beyond theory, the like lived realities of oppression. And so it was there that I met one of my dear friends, Tony Michelle Williams, who leads an organization called Solutions Not Punishments Coalition. But I started working with her and working with other Black trans people in Atlanta who were really trying to change the ways that police would police us as trans people, how Black trans women were being workers and just being held really for no reason a lot of the time. And so that really shifted things for me. And I was like, I still love journalism and storytelling, but I can't do this and not be in service to my communities and not be using the skills that I have, the unique abilities that I have to move towards a bigger vision of liberation. And so that brought me into being more open about my experiences on social media, mostly on Twitter. But it also brought me to the Transgender Law Center. And so it was there that I started doing more, being more outspoken about the trans community, about what was happening specifically to Black trans women. If you don't know, there's what's considered now an epidemic of violence against Black trans women. And actually this time last year, the American Medical Association specifically named it as an epidemic. And so one of the things I've been saying to folks throughout, COVID-19 is like, yes, there's a pandemic, but even before this pandemic, for Black trans people and brown trans people, there was already an epidemic of violence. Yeah. And so I know I said a lot, right? So I don't know if you want to say anything there.
Why I really this is your time to talk about what you do and your experiences. What is your, so you said you're hope to be an author. So what book are you working on right now, or what are you hoping to publish?
Yeah, so what's actually exciting, so my birthday was about 2 weeks ago now. It was like May 22nd. And that was the week that I got news that I got my first book deal.
Hey.
I know, yes. And so I've been working on this book off and on, really for a while, really, even before I had a career. I started trying to chronicle elements of my story in college and the post-college part of my life. And now it has become an essay collection. And while I do have kind of memoir elements in it, I talk about my own personal experiences and stories. A lot of it is about contextualizing my experience and a kind of a larger experience of trans people in America and marginalized people in general. So I'm a whole bunch of things. I am Black, I am trans, I am a woman, I am queer, I'm a feminist, I'm a writer, I've worked in nonprofits, I've worked in corporate media as executive editor of Out Magazine. So I've done a lot of different things. And one thing that's been constant is the reality of anti-Blackness, the reality of trans folks being devalued or underestimated.
Yeah.
Misogyny is everywhere. I know you know this, Lily girl. I know you know this, honey. And so many other things. And so I'm excited about this because I get to dive deep into my experience with my father and him raising a gender nonconforming child who grew up to be a trans woman, and our relationship and how it's just one part of this larger battle of masculinity and femininity being these strict scripts that we have to follow. And what I contend through a lot of the book is that we actually are all on a gender experience.
Mm-hmm.
People want to put trans people into this magical, amazing, glittery box that's, so different than everyone else's experiences. And yes, we're amazing and fabulous and all these great things, but we all have a gender identity, we all have a gender expression, a gender experience. And so, what I think a lot of people outside of the trans community don't understand is that what we're doing and trying to dismantle these binaries actually liberates everyone. And so for the boys and the men, and I know we've known some or many who don't feel like they can have and be emotional and express themselves in certain ways, right? That they can only be angry, they can only be domineering, they can only be in power over someone. They need a new way forward. For the women and the girls and the feminine folks who are told that they can't be leaders, that they can't be strong, that they aren't brilliant, that we can't lean on their strengths in all of these different ways. They need a better way forward. And we've been building that. I think through feminism, there's been a movement to build that, right? But then there's also a whole slew of folks who are gender nonconforming, who are non-binary, who are non-normative and trans, or any of these different ways of being in terms of gender. And they also need a new way forward that allows them to live in their dignity.
Yeah.
And live in all of that goodness that actually is going to free up everyone else to look at themselves in a new way. So I think that is the task at hand, is like, how do we communicate that to the world? And so in this moment when there is this revolution we've talked about, and there is a renewed interest in the Black Lives Matter movement. Some folks actually are pushing for us to go beyond that, a new Black Power movement, right? What does that look like? We also need to be looking at these other structures, because it's not just the police that is harming folks and killing folks. It's our government writ large,
Right.
who harming our immigrant family, right? Putting up these ideas of these borders, which is so funny, I think, to a lot of folks of color, a lot of indigenous folks, a lot of people who really lean into the history of this country, that a lot of those barriers are BS, and a government that is denying the reality of what's happening in the environment, of large scale
Change.
yeah,
Like,
class warfare, all of these different things.
yeah.
There's also a statement that has to be made about the dignity of all people, regardless of their experience, and specifically people of the Black trans experience. And I will say that's one thing that I feel like has fallen, essentially under the bus in this conversation about what violence looks like. Because last year and the years before, there's been at least 20 Black and brown, mostly Black trans women murdered,
Right.
a lot of times by men in our communities, and there's often not a space for us to talk about that. There was a Black trans man in Tallahassee named Tony McDade who was murdered by police, and people have not been rallying around him in the way that they should. I've been to protests where it was only a handful of folks, including me, who were lifting up Tony McDade's name. And so there's also kind of a respectability that we have around who deserves justice when they experience violence and who doesn't.
Right. Why do you think Black trans people are seeming like getting the brunt of this violence?
It's so many things, right? And it's good. I will preface that it's going to be impossible for me to name all of these things, right? I mean, it's almost like us trying to figure out the ins and outs of why white supremacy exists, right? We know that a big project that we may never even completely uncover everything that has gone into constructing it. Um, what's on my heart right now in trying to answer that question is, I think that we already know that there's anti-Blackness in our society, right? Just given kind of the historical standing of Black folks, through enslavement, through colonization of Black spaces around the world, through Jim Crow, and
Sorry, being right now. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Please go ahead.
it's so cute. And through obviously like Jim Crow and kind of building a new system of discriminating against Black folks. So the anti-Blackness is there for Black trans folks. Then we get into how queerness has been ostracized throughout history. I mean, some of the earliest records we have of queer and gender nonconforming folks are court records. So there were folks in the 1800s who were Black and trans who are documented in the court system, like Mary Jones, who was a sex worker who essentially was put on trial for stealing the wallet of one of the men that she was engaged in activity with, and she went as herself and through her testimony made the case for her to express her gender the way she should, and that was in the 1830s.
Oh,
And then there is another case of a woman named Frances Thompson, a Black trans woman who was in the Memphis riots in the 1850s or 60s, I believe. So, around the time of the Civil War. And she actually experienced sexual violence from a mob of white men. And so that is documented in federal court records. And so we have always been here. We may not have always used the same language. We may not have always had access to the things that we know we deserve to express ourselves truly. But Black transness has always existed. And it will always exist, right? So I guess just to put a cap on all of that, it's like we're dealing with the anti-Blackness. We're dealing with the way that homophobia and transphobia exists in our society. And then when you get to the misogyny piece, right, of how women were at one point also property, right? You've got this tangled web of threats that are coming at us from every direction that are telling us that we shouldn't exist. And so often what I think of Black trans folks have experienced is that even when people get one element of marginalization, even if they're a person of color or a Black person who understands racial oppression, that doesn't mean that they get these other pieces. Even if you're a woman, that doesn't mean that, you get racial oppression if you're a white woman in the same way that like women of color would. And then if you're not queer or trans, there can be even more discord. So I contend that there needs to be a lot more political education. I hope at some point to work with some folks to build out this larger kind of community curriculum so that we can all just figure out these different pieces of oppression that are plaguing us on various fronts, but that we all have some knowledge around.
course. I think there's a
I
lot.
have all the answers.
Yeah, right. No, but I think there's a lot of a lack of understanding trans in general. I think maybe in the past couple of years, people have been kind of discovering what it is more so because you're now seeing the media and TV shows and movies, transgender are being seen in a way I don't think they have before. And so I think that now is the time to start educating people about that and hopefully with a sense of understanding, obviously people will be able to, like you said, like rally around the Black transgender men who have been killed in this country in the past however many years because of just kind of being misunderstood and being seemingly, have all the things against them, being queer, being black, being transgender, kind of like it puts such a target on their
Yeah,
back. Horrifying.
it does. Yeah. Yeah, and I think some of the I guess actionable items are, things like this, right? Like, thank you, Lily, for using your platform to have these discussions, and to break bread. Well, I'm not eating right now. I wish I was. I'm a little hungry, but in a way, break bread with folks who have different experiences. I mean,
Yeah.
because have such a career and people look up to you. And so what you're modeling right now is just going to reverberate, and then other people are going to look in their own lives and be like, how can I open up, my maybe 500 followers to a new conversation or whatever. So that is powerful. Other ways people can support, I mean, if you have funds, especially during Pride Month, I'm trying to push people to not abandon the LGBTQ community at this moment, because I think a lot of times people are like, oh, well, we're focusing on Black issues, so queer issues have to move to the side. Well, there are Black, queer, and trans people, clearly. So what you can do if you're trying to figure out how to touch everything is support Black, queer, and trans-led organizations, support ones that are moving work to change the material realities of Black, queer, and trans folks. And I'll reshare a list
Yeah.
that I had earlier this week, crafted with my friend Philip Picardi. It's a few, and then we're working on something else. And then there's also just continuing to have those hard conversations, those like conversations of accountability when Black trans people are not in the room. And that, I think, is the piece that on the surface seems so easy, but it actually is really difficult. And I can acknowledge, I think, the difficulty. I've had, white friends, who have all these Trump supporting, family members, and they're like, I don't even know how to go about this with them. I'm feeling anxious. Or they have, maybe other relatives who are homophobic or transphobic, and they say something and they're like, I was caught up in the moment. I didn't even know how to respond. And you can't respond every time. But you should be on the lookout for the next time so you can be ready. So arm yourself with the stories, arm yourself with the facts, and also arm yourself with empathy, and understand that we all started at a place where we didn't know anything. I didn't come out of my mama, knowing what transgender meant. I had to find that on my journey. And so also figure out ways to be both accountable, and active, and also extending empathy and grace.
I think even just becoming educated about the community in general will just bring empathy naturally.
Mm,
When you about something, when you educate yourself, if you're a if you have a heart, you should be able to find empathy within yourself. So I think that's really important. How would you suggest, people who want to understand the term transgender or what it's like to be a Black transgender woman? Do you have um, any tips for people who would like to dive into that and really educate themselves, like as far as books, or obviously you're going to come out with a book, which is congratulations again, that's amazing. But are there any, uh, do you have any kind of tips or suggestions for people themselves right now?
yeah. I think if you're if you're looking, I guess, kind of for just like a baseline introduction, of course you can Google. That's the thing, but if you want a deeper dive, I think, you know, you do follow those voices that are constantly talking about these things, right? Like, I'm not the only one who talks about the Black trans experience. There's people like Janet Mock, there's people like India Moore, you know, a lot of our stars. We're lucky a lot of times in our community to have stars who are politically educated,
Hmm.
and interested in tying back to our community. Um, so yeah, so I think, you know, some of the stars from Pose, like Janet Mock, India Moore, other folks. Janet has books out. There's also been another book out from Alok, who is a brown transgender nonconforming person, who has also written and talked a lot and actually performed a lot about queer and trans experiences, and specifically breaking down the binary. Um, yeah, I'm trying to think what else. I mean, there's definitely, you know, some documentaries out there. Um, Discourse is I believe it's out. Laverne Cox, I believe, executive produced and maybe hosted it. I haven't seen it yet, unfortunately. But it's about trans folks in Hollywood and in media. Um, there is obviously Paris is Burning. It's kind of like an OG like documentary about Black, queer, and trans folks in the ball and vogue culture of New York in
Hmm.
the 80s. So that's kind of a foundational documentary, which is really great. I first watched it in college. There's also something more fun. HBO Max, if you have HBO Max, is the legendary show that it has like Jamila Jamil and Megan Thee Stallion and Naomi Maldonado, who is like this queen of like ball culture. But it's actually a competition show. I just watched the first episode last night with my friend, with Kimberly, actually.
Oh,
Kimberly, Phil, and our friend Chris. And so, so that's on my mind. But we're out there, you know, just do a little digging. I think the easiest entry point is just to follow some folks who are talking about these issues, and then you'll find like the network.
sure. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
First. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on here and talk to me, talk to the thousands of people who are interested in hearing what you have to say and your story. I think I've been doing lives for a couple days now, and people are responding so well, and they're learning a lot. I think the most important thing that can come out of this is just educating people.
Mm.
So again, thank you for educating and continue to speak up about your experience, because we don't know, you know, I don't know what it's like to be Black. And so I hear it from you, and want to know your experience. Oh, I can't wait to read your book
Me either, child.
when it comes out. If I can help in any way, um, I would love to read it. Thank you again for taking the time. Is there anything else you want to drive home, or are you?
I think that's it. We talked about so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
And thank you so much. Yeah. And you do have, Kimberly was saying yesterday, but you do have some very like supportive, amazing fans. I know a few hit me up and were like, "Oh my God, you're going live with Lily," and a few people that knew me. So yeah.
I'm glad they're being supportive. That's wonderful. I'm happy to
Yeah. All right.
stay
Well,
safe.
okay. Bye.
Yeah. Take care. Bye.